Good evening, everyone. I am Lisa from the Concerned Artists of the Philippines, which is an organization of Filipino artists and cultural workers. CAP, or CAP, was founded 35 years ago in 1983. As a formation, CAP builds solidarity around the principles of freedom, justice, and democracy. And these can be seen as translations of the desire or articulations of the possibility for non-fascist living. But also these are terms that are also now being dangerously appropriated within and by authoritarian systems themselves. So what we are to share tonight, therefore, is what a small contribution to what we consider as larger acts of countering this inertia of disbelief, quote unquote, in the face of such a situation. For whenever we talk about reenacting and seeking forums for justice, memory and remembering play a crucial role in reclaiming our common lexicons of struggle. I first show, so here's a map of the Philippines, roughly 10,000 miles away from here, and it's comprised of more than 7,000 islands, so it's a nation that is both agricultural and archipelagic, connected by the sea. It shares with other Southeast Asian nations both a lingering history of colonialism, and in the case of the Philippines, a history of colonialism under Spain, Japan, and the United States. But one thing that it also shares in common with other Southeast Asian nations and beyond would be its experience of authoritarian rule, especially during the post-war period. Now, the experience of fascist rule is one that has indeed touched the country. Martial law was imposed by President Ferdinand Marcos on September 21, 1972, following political unrest over the socio-economic crisis. And by the time CAP was founded in 1983, the dictatorship was already well in place for 11 years. The regime eventually finally fell to a popular revolt in 1986. But the figures of the regime and the figures in power within that regime have over the years steadily crept their way back into the halls of power today. And they still are the powerful people within Philippine society. One of the challenges with this kind of situation is remembering in a time of historical amnesia. We should never underestimate the power of images deployed for or against fascism. This, for instance, this is the first image that made an impression on me as a child. It was a book lying around the house, and that was its cover artwork. The book's title was The Conjugal Dictatorship of Ferdinand and Imelda Marcos. Now, I was born way after the book was published in 1976, and therefore too young to have any real memories of the dictatorship. So it just remained a vision until I could fully grapple with what it corresponded to in real terms, which was, in reality, a vicious era of wealth and privilege for a few, which tore the social fabric apart, which naturalized present-day problems, including economic inequity, dynastic rule, patronage politics, corruption, the legalization of injustice, and the plunder of patrimony and ecology. And these are all problems that we face up to now in the country. Now, like other fascist regimes around the world, the Marcos dictatorship violated human rights on a scale which haunts us up to this day. Thousands were imprisoned, killed, forcibly disappeared, or dispossessed. The book's author himself, Primitivo Mijares, is a desaparecido, or one of the disappeared, for writing the book. Now the Marcos regime controlled a lot of things. Mass media, it patronized the arts and culture sectors and industries. It funded ambitious infrastructure projects to the extent of pursuing what is now called by architectural historians as an edifice complex. So all of these degrees of control created conditions for censorship and cultural complicity with the regime. But also, it created conditions for criticality and action against such symbolic and real violence. Now, CAP's own history as an organization is rooted in these collective responses against repression. The organization CAP was the result of a campaign back in the early 1980s. It was called Free the Artist, Free the Media Movement. And it was a campaign against an executive order issued by Marcos, which proposed to expand the power of the former Board of Censors. Now, the protest was supported by artists numbering hundreds, almost 500, who eventually formed what is now known as CAP. I now share this excerpt from a very short video from the organization, and it weaves found footage of an interview with the late film director and Philippine national artist Lino Broca, which speaks about where he comes from and where he was coming from as an artist who joined the organization.
I am fighting for an atmosphere wherein I could make the kind of films I'd like to make with the least compromise. And to do that, you have to change the system. You cannot just sort of confine yourself to the problems of movie making, like censorship or high taxes and all that. In the beginning, I did not get myself involved with all this parliament of the streets or all this protest movement. I felt and I thought that by not cooperating with the government, everything would be okay. You know, my conscience was clear and clean. Nobody can tell me that you cooperated with a government that did not respect human rights, you know, a government that declared martial law and took away the rights of its citizens, the right to express themselves, the right to assemble peacefully and to strike or to protest, you know. For a long time, I would see these people marching in the streets, and I would hear about salvagings, and I would hear about people being arrested, and I didn't do anything about that. I was not part of the protesting group. But all that changed when one day I read about these people who were being imprisoned. I suddenly realized that it was not enough to act individually.
But the footage of the protests, which were juxtaposed with the interview, all happened very recently, just within the span of this year. Incidentally, the filmmaker, J.L. Burgos, who made this, has a history connected with that of the dictatorship. His father was a top journalist who was imprisoned during the years of martial law, while his brother, Jonas, was a peasant organizer who was abducted by the Philippine military in April 2007 and remains missing up to now. So right now, the Philippines faces this kind of situation where rising tyranny and a human rights crisis is upon the people. Currently, more than 20,000 people are estimated to have been killed in the war against illegal drugs waged by the current president, Rodrigo Duterte, since mid-2016. The resource-rich region of Mindanao remains under a state of martial law, which is slowly creeping up to the other provinces as well. The counterinsurgency program under President Duterte has also left more than 200 activists dead, more than 2,000 illegally arrested without detention, around 100 people tortured, and more than 500 in jail as political prisoners. And we are talking about an administration which does not openly identify itself as a dictatorship yet. In the Philippines and around the world, incidents of repression and resistance are happening in what seems to be a twisted reenactment of history itself. Now, the challenge for all of us who are engaged in imaginative and artistic practice is how to embrace these broader affinities beyond self. It is also this context of continuity that informs the anti-dictatorship struggle in the country. This brings us to the core of today's inquiries. How do we imagine and work towards conditions that resist the expansion of fascist systems? At a time when historical revisionism, fake news, and claims to a post-truth world continue to reinforce and enact histories of violence, how do we enable conditions for justice to happen, or at least continue to imagine this within our collective consciousness and practice? The role of memory making and cultural resistance is therefore a vital one, invested with a weight and urgency with the times. Last October, for instance, the military started red tagging and targeting for harassment and surveillance various filmmakers and schools which showed films on human rights and martial law. This is a move related to the revision and erasure of this history of fascism, which I have been talking about. As an organization, we in CAP do not allow such threats to prevail. Since then, more than 800 members of the film and art community in the Philippines have signed up to a manifesto condemning these attacks and harassment. Our generation of artist activists is now thinking of ways of how to counter such harassment and find resonance in the resistances of the past. Now, one of the activities that we've been holding recently since then, that happened in October, so it has been indeed just a succession of campaigns and activities, one after the other. And one of the recent ones which I wanted to share was, this, last December 3, where CAP and other organizations sponsored a screening of the digitally remastered version of the Filipino classic film Sakada, which roughly translated means a lowly paid farm worker. The film was made in 1976, during the height of the Marcos dictatorship, and it was directed by one of the founding members of CAP later on, the late Ben Cervantes. It was screened that same year, in 1976. That was also the year when the book The Conjugal Dictatorship was published. When this film was screened, its copies were confiscated and its director was imprisoned. But the film was, we felt it was important to show this film because it is set in the island of Negros, which up to now remains one of the main targets of the counterinsurgency program of the military. The island of Negros is filled with sugarcane plantations, a largely agricultural economy, and the film revolves around the lives of the Sakadas who live in the most precarious and feudal of conditions. It connects us to Negros in the practice of reenacting a massacre that happened during the time of the dictatorship in the town of Escalante on September 20, 1985. We shared what we wanted to share at this point would be how this town in Negros, which experienced the massacre, would continue to reenact the memory of that massacre 33 years up to the present time. So we are sharing the recollections of CAP member Alejandro Dioma, who is a community cultural worker since the 1980s. Dioma participated in the first reenactment in 1986 and served as the director of the group Teatro Obrero, or Workers' Theater, which usually initiates this activity along with other local organizations. The 1985 Escalante massacre happened just 2 years after CAP itself was founded. It was already 13 years into the 13 years since the martial law was declared in 1972. The massacre happened on the occasion of a nationwide three-day Welgang Bayan, or people's strike, against the dictatorship. Here, simultaneous actions across the regions and islands were taking place. Strike centers were set up in the towns of Negros, including Escalante. And in the public plaza where this occurs, the strike was violently dispersed by police and paramilitary forces who attacked the protesters with dirty water from fire trucks, tear gas, and machine gun fire. The violence left 20 people dead, mostly sugarcane workers and students. It also left hundreds wounded and missing. Currently, a monument to the Martyrs of Escalante stands on the same site. But every year for the past 33 years since 1986, the events and the massacre that took place on that day have been reenacted by the survivors themselves, by members of people's organizations, and by the community without fail, and largely without state funding. The March to the Public Square is joined by both survivors and younger generations of people. Ironically, the calls and demands of that distant time are still the same until now. The call for genuine land reform, food security, and an end to the militarization of the countryside. Now, artists and cultural workers also contribute performances, street theater, visual arts, works of visual arts such as murals, dances, poetry, and other forms, while immersing in the community in preparation for this reenactment. But what remains distinct and special about this is that it is based on the community and cultural workers' effort, resolve, and self-reliance, taking months of groundwork, preparation, mobilization, and solidarity with the areas where daily life unfolds. In this sense, the Escalante reenactments serve to not only prolong trauma or nostalgia, but to actively and organically stake out a position against forgetting. These are acts of memorializing, monumentalizing, and asserting vigilance against state violence. As translations of living memory and a reliving of evidence, these initiatives give us hope at a time when the impetus is generally to forget, to move on, to whitewash, and deny the violence of both the past and the present. Now, this mural is interesting. It was made by a local cultural organization, but it was based on the study of a mural which was made for the reenactment years before. So they have been reenacting even the mural itself for the reenactment. But the case of the Escalante killings, it's not an isolated one. It is not the only massacre which happened in the Philippines. There have been so many massacres of peasant communities, striking workers, people in dissent over the years. We can make an entire list from this. It is all part of a long and unfolding history of fascist violence against the peasant sector, as well as other marginalized groups. Last October 20, barely 2 or 3 months passed, 9 peasants in the nearby town of Sagay in Negros Occidental, which is also near Escalante, 9 peasants were killed while conducting a bungkalan, or a land cultivation action, during the Tiempo Muerto, or dead season. So the farmers were asserting their rights to land and the right to till the land for food at a time of scarcity. But they ended up dead, like many others before. The abductions, arrests, and killings of activists and those who dare stand up to the powers that be continue up to now as we speak. So in the recent week, there have been arrests of peace consultants in the Philippines, abductions, killings, one after the other. This is something that you would think only happens within a dictatorship, but it does not. This has happened again and again, even within administrations which supposedly were enacting democracy, so to speak. Now, while the usual avenues for enacting justice remain closed, we also look to other channels where justice can be symbolically, if not politically, meted. I cite here an excerpt of a report from the Philippine Senate Special Committee report, which investigated the violent dispersal of demonstrations on the occasion of President Marcos's national address in 1970. So that was 2 years before he declared martial law and before the dictatorship inflicted itself on the body politic. This investigation was called in response to an incident where effigies were thrown and where police violently dispersed the rallyists who were protesting against President Marcos's speech. Anyway, the Senate committee report body concluded the fact that the people had turned to demonstrating to ventilate their anger and frustration reflects on the whole body of our society. The system, the establishment, the opposition, the judiciary, the police forces, and the press, which are the normal avenues of reforms, but are apparently not filling this function satisfactorily. It is in these parallel sites of enacting justice where the process also unfolds. Other forms to which art practice has contributed to developing, at least in the Philippine context, are the holding of alternative or quasi-judicial parliaments, people's trials, burnings of effigies, citizens' courts, which are all performative and symbolic representations of justice at a time when it remains elusive to many. In 2015, for instance, so Earlier, I showed various images of effigies produced over the span of 3 decades, maybe 4, no, 3. Effigies of President Marcos as Hitler, effigies of succeeding presidents such as Joseph Estrada as Arabzilla, the monster, images of President Gloria Arroyo, who is currently the Speaker of the House, as Hitler in disguise, as a flying monster, and currently an effigy of President Duterte, which can be interchanged with the face of Hitler and Marcos and a dog. But these effigies are usually paraded for big rallies of the day, where they are burned as a form of public trial and condemnation of the president and the policies that they represent. As for tribunals, we also recall and cite the Open Source Tribunal being involved in events such as the Open Source Tribunal back in 2015. So the OST, the Open Source Tribunal, was a result of the interaction between Basis voor Actuele Kunst, the New World Academy, and CAP in response to the tragedy of Typhoon Haiyan, which hit the Philippines at that time. So we were interested in talking about the question of accountability in the wake of the typhoon's damage to the communities. Another more recent example would be the International People's Tribunal, held in Brussels, Belgium last September, which as a body declared the Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte guilty of various crimes and attacks against the people's socio-economic and political rights, to ventilate and to also affirm the degree and depth of violations that are occurring left and right. Reenactments, trials, and tribunals are all therefore platforms for enacting the challenge of imagining justice. It is important to consider how creative actions and moments of artistic production hold weight as interventions, not merely as intermissions, that open symbolic and sometimes physical spaces for effective solidarity to take place. Now, CAP's work this year has really focused on strengthening the organization's ranks against many threats. It has focused on amplifying the call to stop the attacks on the Filipino people's rights, and it has focused also on strengthening cooperation between CAP and other artist organizations, which formed also as a response to rising state fascism in the Philippines and elsewhere in the world. They say it takes a leap of radical imagination to commit to the vision of a non-fascist world, and to channel artistic and all sorts of labor towards that end. So now I share, to end this presentation, I end with with showing this video collaboration between CAP officer Leonilo Doloricon and CAP member Tom Estrella. So they are from 2 generations of artist activists who collaborated on this video. It is titled Bihag, or Prisoner, and it threads through the different lives that we cherish and protect against from the attacks by the state. The question of reenacting and enacting what vision of a non-fascist world and for whom is something that we constantly try to answer in our practice and in our everyday and how we prevail in our everyday activities. These are questions that we have to contend with, and we really have to answer always. For remembering does not only encompass the past or a historical era, but also the present time and the people that we encounter every day. For whom do we strive to remember, strive to continue with this practice? We strive to remember the people who labor every day to make ends meet, who toil in line in order to support families hit by the economic slump, whether in the Philippines or in other countries where they may find themselves. The workers who are down on their knees, whose backs and bones and muscles and hands make the rituals of everyday life possible for entire households, cities, and nations outside of home, are also among those people who we remember. These are also the people who have been sold, weighed, bled, and valued for their labor alone and nothing else. They who are shipped across borders, channels, and territories, but who themselves remain immobile and invisible even as they are dispersed. We remember the migrants, the mothers, and the children, the dispossessed in the city and its slums, those who need a refuge and a home to stay in, and jobs to keep. We remember the people who remain imprisoned for their beliefs and actions towards making a better world. We remember the fallen and the dead, the disappeared and their kin who until now know no rest, those who offered their lives to something greater, far greater than themselves. Lastly, we also remember the people who lived in and toiled on the land to make it grow, in the same way that the fallen farmers of Escalante, of Sagay, of Hacienda Luisita, of numerous peasant communities who have been hit by fascism did. They who work to feed the rest of us and the rest of the world, but who themselves have nothing to eat. They who have nothing but who dared stand up against another fascist dictatorship, then and now. It is because of people like them that we choose not to forget. So we will remember and we will dissent. So with that, thank you.